All right, well, good evening. Good evening. There we go. Wow, you're excited. This is going to be good. Well, I want to welcome you to an evening of exploring together how to build for cultural reformation with our special guest, Dr. John G. West. I am not a doctor, nor do I play one on TV, but my name is John, and I serve as one of the pastors here. Yeah. And really thrilled to have all of you here this evening for this talk. We're going to talk about just the brief kind of plan for our evening, how it's going to flow, what our agenda is. But before we do that, let me pray for our time. Father God, we thank you that you have sent your Son into the world to rescue us and to call us out of a kingdom of darkness and into the kingdom of your Son, to be a holy nation, to be a royal priesthood sent into the world with good news to make disciples. Father, you know, there are times we feel overwhelmed and confused as we look at what's taking place around us, and yet you are never overwhelmed and never confused. And so I pray that tonight, that through Dr. John, that you would give us understanding, that you would help us to think clearly, biblically, strategically about what it means to be your people in this world at this moment, at this time. And I pray that it would produce a greater hope, a greater obedience, and a greater harvest in our community. We have things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, well, our plan for this evening is fairly simple. We're going to have a time of lecture and teaching, and then that is going to be followed by a short time of Q&A. If you would like to submit a question to be considered for the Q&A time, you can submit those questions at slido.com. I think we've got, there it is right there, slido.com, and use the event code Dr. West, just DRWEST. And you'll see our event, and you can submit your question. You can also look at other questions that people have submitted, and if you want one of those questions to be asked, you can vote for it. So submit your questions, vote for questions. No silly questions, please, but please vote and submit your questions. And so at the end, we'll be looking at that technology and asking questions from that. Our topic for discussion, as you already know, is building for cultural renewal, building for cultural reformation. 2020 was a tumultuous and difficult year for many reasons. However, I think many of us would look back at that time and say that it also provided a much-needed wake-up call for the church and awakening us to many of the things that have been going on in our culture and within our institutions. And I know the elders here at Coram Deo Church, both of them are here right now. In many ways, we felt caught off guard by the things that happened, and were honestly ill-prepared for the challenges that we had to face and the challenges that we are still facing in our culture. However, we are awake, and the reason you're here this evening is because you're awake and you want to learn as well. And one of the questions that we are always asking is this: what can we do? And what ought we to do? And how is it that we can build for cultural reformation? So tonight, we get to explore that topic together, and that leads me to our guest speaker. It is our great pleasure and honor to have Dr. John G. West with us tonight. If I were to read his entire bio, we would be here a long time. So I'm going to give you some of the highlights, just a glimpse, okay? And I'm just going to read this because I can't remember all of it. Dr. John West currently serves as Vice President and Senior Fellow at Discovery Institute and serves as the Managing Director of the Institute's Center for Science and Culture, which he also co-founded. Dr. West previously served as an associate professor of political science at Seattle Pacific University when they were still a Christian institution, and has taught political science and history at California State University, San Bernardino, and Azusa Pacific University. He is the author and editor of 12 books and has directed and written a number of documentaries, including a documentary called Human Zoos, which you need to check out, and you can do that at his website, which is johngwest.com. He holds a PhD in government from Claremont Graduate University and a BA in communication from the UW. Go Dogs. He can't walk on water, but he knows a guy who can. So let's give him a warm welcome, our guest speaker, Dr. John G. West.
Thank you. Great. Thank you, Pastor Don. This is delightful to be here with actually such a really awake crowd. I hope I will not put you to sleep. And although I guess I am Dr. John West, don't ask me for medical advice because I'm not really a real doctor. You wouldn't want to follow it. So let's get started. I'm going to take you back to the 8th century AD, in what later became Germany. There was a Christian missionary known as Winifred Boniface. He took an axe to a tree dedicated to the pagan god Thor. Reportedly, a blast from heaven then pitched over the tree, and Boniface used the wood to build a Christian church. Well, let's go into last year, December 2023 in Iowa. Self-identified Christian conservative and former political candidate Michael Cassidy decapitates this pagan idol set up by a private group calling itself the Satanic Temple in the state capitol building. Mr. Cassidy is now being prosecuted for a hate crime. The destruction of this idol in Iowa provoked considerable controversy and debate. Is Cassidy a latter-day Boniface, striking a blow against blasphemy and for Christian civilization? Is he just a vandal? Should Christians destroy the property of groups they disagree with? Should government in America only allow the display of Christian symbols on public property? Should government in America explicitly promote and enforce Christianity? The blow-up over what happened in Iowa is just a sliver of a much larger debate many Christians in America are having right now because our culture seems to be in a death spiral. There. Increased crime, family breakdown, out of control, drug use, racial and ethnic hostility, gender confusion, growing homelessness, mental illness, and anxiety. Social media and entertainment media that promote more and more depravity. As our culture falls apart, it's the institutions we depend on for vibrant communities, churches, families, education and schools, the business community, and the media all appear to be failing us. According to a recent survey, less than 2 in 10 Americans have a great deal of confidence in the church, public schools, newspapers, banks, the medical system, or the criminal justice system. More than 80% of Americans think the moral state of the nation is getting worse. And then in a new book, a Christian management consultant named Aaron Wren argues that we now live in a negative world where Christianity itself is viewed as a threat rather than a help. As our culture continues to disintegrate, many Christians, I think, are earnestly seeking a way forward. How do we get out of this mess? What should we do to bring back a healthier culture? What can we do? Tonight, I hope to share some possibilities. However, before we discuss what I think Christians can and should be doing to rebuild our culture, I'd like to offer one caution about what I don't think we should be doing. In the last couple of years, a particularly vocal group of evangelical Christians have embraced something they are calling Christian nationalism. Maybe they really are, but I think I will move. I think I'll try. Oh, there it is. There it is. Anyway. Now, I want to be careful here. Christian nationalism is a slippery term and can mean very different things to different people. Many sincere Christians simply use the term to argue that Christians should be active in the public square based on biblical principles of morality. Completely agree with that. Other Christians employ the term Christian nationalism to distinguish their views from various forms of globalism. They think that self-government requires local governance wherever possible. Again, right on, exactly right. But a smaller yet influential group of evangelicals mean more when they advocate Christian nationalism. Here I'm primarily referring to a book published in 2022 by Stephen Wolfe called The Case for Christian Nationalism. There are many serious problems raised by the proposals of Wolff and some of his followers, not the least of which is their embrace of ethnic and racial divisions and their claim that no nation, properly speaking, can be composed of two or more ethnicities. But tonight, I want to focus on Wolff's yearning for what he calls a Christian prince as our earthly hope, and his endorsement of, quote, a measured and theocratic Caesarism, unquote. According to Wolff, we need a Christian prince who represents Christ as the Son of God to his people. Wolff further thinks that this government strongman should exercise authority over the church. According to Wolff, his Christian prince isn't technically supposed to be the head of the church, but he nevertheless has the duty to correct lazy and erring pastors. He should use the government to publish blasphemy, heresy, false teachers, and idolatry. He should use tax dollars to fund ministers and schools of theology. He should even dictate how you design your church for worship. Wolff says, for example, that the Christian prince may require the elevation of the pulpit above the Lord's table in church construction and dictate suitable arrangements of church furniture based on his theological convictions for proper worship. The Christian prince, really a Christian dictator, also can compel by force of law all baptized individuals to attend church. That's certainly one way to raise attendance at worship. He also argues that a Christian minority has the right to impose a Christian theocracy on a majority of people who aren't Christians, and that non-Christians should have more limited civil rights than Christians. Wolff says he supports religious liberty, but ironically, his definition of religious liberty is pretty much a mirror image of the really narrow vision of religious liberty espoused by secularists. Secularists insist that they aren't violating your conscience rights if they punish you for your actions or even your politically incorrect statements because they're merely dictating your external behavior. They aren't dictating what you privately believe in your heart. So you can follow God according to your conscience so long as it doesn't produce actions the state opposes or publicly share views the state opposes. Really, for me, it's hard to see a principal difference between the secularist view of religious liberty and Wolff's view. Notably, Wolff's book is skimpy on scriptural justifications for his views and equally skimpy on any discussion of the views of the early church. Now, things are so bad in our culture, it can be tempting to grasp for cures and be desperate for anything that's offered as a cure. So someone who comes along and proclaims that a Christian Caesar can save us can be tempting. But I think we need to be careful that in the name of a really opposing secularism, we don't adopt a cure that is as bad or worse than the original disease. Fortunately, I think there's a better way. It starts by reclaiming the robust Christian tradition of religious liberty. It's true that God instituted a type of theocracy in the Old Testament. It was tied to the Jews in ancient Israel, but we are not ancient Israel, and in the New Testament, neither Jesus nor his apostles called for instituting a theocracy, let alone using government to force people to become Christians. Indeed, in the parable of the wheat and the tares, in Matthew 13, Jesus seemed to teach the opposite. In that parable, a sower plants wheat, but an enemy comes in and plants weeds during the night. The workers then ask the owner whether they should pull out the weeds right now. The owner says, no. They should wait until the wheat and the weeds grow up to maturity, and then they will be separated at harvest. Jesus told his disciples later that the field in the parable was the world, and that the wheat represents the sons of the kingdom, while the weeds represent the sons of the devil. And they shouldn't be separated or rooted out until the end of the age at the last judgment. The implication was that we should not be trying to rid the world of those who don't follow God. That's God's task at the end of the age, not ours. The Apostle Paul, meanwhile, in 1 Timothy chapter 2, urges Christians to offer prayers for kings and all those who are in high positions so that we may dominate? No. So that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. In other words, we should pray for the liberty to practice our faith in our daily lives, including during national pandemics like COVID. Paul did not advocate praying that we might get government power to impose Christianity on others. At the same time, Paul was willing to use his rights as a Roman citizen to defend his freedom to spread the gospel and act as a Christian. The idea that religion should be free from civil compulsion was the standard teaching of the Christian church in its earliest centuries. In the late 2nd and early 3rd century, for example, Christian writer Tertullian wrote this: "It's a fundamental human right, a privilege of nature, that every man should worship according to his own convictions. One man's religion neither harms nor helps another man. It is assuredly no part of religion to compel religion." After the Roman Emperor Constantine became a Christian, he issued the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, which reflected the culmination of this historic Christian teaching on religious liberty. That edict declared, "We resolve to grant both to the Christians and to all men freedom to follow the religion which they choose." Tragically, after this enactment of religious liberty, things became confused, and many later Christians ended up embracing government power to decide theological questions in one form or another. They also advocated the persecution both of non-Christians and fellow Christians with whom they disagreed. The persecution of Christians by other Christians persisted into the early American colonies. In 17th century Massachusetts, Baptist preacher Obadiah Holmes was tied to a whipping post and viciously whipped 30 times with a 3-corded whip. Baptist. He was lucky. In the 1650s, in Puritan Massachusetts, 3 Quaker missionaries were hanged. In the 18th century in Virginia, preachers were jailed for running afoul of Virginia's government-established Anglican church. If you weren't Anglican, you could be jailed. By the early decades of the 19th century, however, government-sponsored churches in America were ending. Eventually, nearly all Christians in America increasingly understood what the early Christians in the first 3 centuries of the Christian era understood, that religious liberty as a civil matter is a good thing. So is a separation between church and state, so long as that separation is properly defined. Separating church and state does not mean separating either the state or the culture from the influence of Christians. Christians can still influence government and culture, but as equal citizens under the law, exercising the same rights of free speech and religious liberty that apply to all. Separating church and state also does not mean that the state cannot take actions based on the natural moral law God wrote on our hearts, which Paul describes in Romans 2, and which applies to all people at all times. Christians should become active in public life. Their political proposals should be informed by their biblical beliefs about virtue and justice. But Christian engagement in public life as salt and light does not require, indeed is harmed by trying to use the power of the state to enforce worship or punish heresy or even fund a church's budget. Indeed, Christians should support the rights of conscience for everyone as much as possible for several reasons. First, as already described, it follows the example of Jesus and his apostles who preached love and compassion, not coercion. Second, it follows the universal teaching of the early church, which supported religious freedom for all up to the Edict of Milan. 3, compulsion in religion breeds hypocrisy, not true Christianity. If you get civil rewards for being a Christian, you get more hypocrites, not more Christians. For any of you who like Jane Austen, remember the figure of Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice. Does anyone remember Mr. Collins? What is he known for?
He is not a joy to be around.
Okay, but what does he want to become, though? What does...
Become a pastor and get married.
Okay, so because in one of the things you did, especially if you're a large family and your property would only go to one son, for the extra sons, they had to have other things to do. Well, you had this thing called the state church in England, and so you trundle them off as this employment agency. You just go off and have a sinecure with state-funded salary. But that ends up producing a lot of people, a lot of pastors who aren't necessarily in it primarily for the gospel. And Jane Austen, who was the daughter of a clergyman, knew something about that. And so Mr. Collins is if you want to understand why a state church isn't a good idea, read about Mr. Collins. Compulsion in religion, also number 4. So let's see, get going. Can lead us to pridefully overestimate our own role in conversions. People become Christians because God calls them and changes their hearts, not because we threaten them. And then finally, human calls for theocracy in this life do not sufficiently appreciate fallen human nature. The universe is a theocracy, but what is called theocracy in our world is not government by God. It's government by some men claiming to speak for God, and there is a huge difference. If you set up human rulers with civil power to enforce Christianity, you probably won't get a Christianity you recognize. Now, the Puritans in Massachusetts had many fine points. Their confusion of church and state wasn't one of them, as their descendants found out. This is a beautiful church, postcard perfect church in Wayland, Massachusetts. The congregation dates back to the Puritans in the 1640s. The current church building dates back to the early 1800s. It was built with taxpayer money as part of the state church. But here's the thing, it's not a Christian church anymore. Hasn't been for a couple hundred years. It's a Unitarian church. Unitarians reject the Trinity, don't believe Jesus is God. Christianity, by force of law, did not prevent Unitarianism from sweeping through Massachusetts in the early 1800s. And because the churches were paid for by the state, and the taxpayers really helped install the ministers, when Unitarianism became popular, Orthodox Christians were dispossessed of their church building after church building throughout New England. And many of these postcard perfect churches that still exist today are no longer really Christian churches. The state church did nothing to prevent that. If you really think that giving a political leader the right to punish heresy and false teaching is a good idea, think about this. Do you really want, I'm going to be bipartisan here, Joe Biden or Jay Inslee or even Donald Trump, oh, I'm going the wrong way, sorry. Jay Inslee, or even Donald Trump, determining what false Christian teaching is and who to punish for heresy. Because that's what you're talking about if you're talking about a Christian dictator or the head of the government determining that. Do you really want any of them deciding that? It's important to remember that Christianity did not start as a state religion. I think I probably will. I was recommended that I should be using this early. Your AV team is excellent here. This is not their, this is my fault. So, and anyway, I'm going to use that so I don't have to wait. Christianity started as a tiny minority sect in a vast empire, largely hostile to the Christian worldview. But through the workings of the triune God, Christianity became the majority religion. I'd say that this outcome was in spite of the efforts of some to try to spread Christianity by worldly power, not because of such efforts. But how does this work out in practice? How can Christians work to build a healthy society without resorting to theocracy? That's the subject for the rest of my talk. Let me start by telling you about a remarkable tale from American history that you may not know about. It was a time when America was in crisis. Urban crime had exploded as young thugs took over the cities. Promiscuity and substance abuse were rampant. People had stopped going to church. Many professors in the nation's universities were actively hostile to Christianity, preferring to place their trust in secular fads and philosophies rather than a God who operated in human affairs. In politics, traditional religion and morality were flouted. One of the era's most influential presidents was an avowed materialist who scoffed in private at the miracles of the Bible and historic Christian doctrines. Another president was the only president in our history to have murdered someone. Yet voters didn't seem to care. And national political leaders invited a radical social justice activist to give a special public address to Congress, an activist who later proposed a declaration of mental independence that denounced private property, traditional religion, and marriage as, quote, a trinity of the most monstrous evils that could be combined to inflict mental and physical evil upon man's whole race, unquote. In many ways, America in this negative world of the early 1800s, for that's when each of these events occurred, was remarkably like America today. Yet most historians wouldn't describe 19th century America as godless or secularist or amoral. If anything, the period is often held up as the epitome of a Christian America, when Christianity was all but the de facto religion of the culture, and when biblical ethics supplied the basis for social relations. Nor would criminologists describe the 19th century, at least the second half of it, as awash in crime. In fact, as criminologist James Q. Wilson once pointed out, lawlessness went down in the latter half of the 19th century, despite urbanization, industrialization, and other factors typically associated with increased crime. So what's going on here? Were the 1800s the time of Christian America or godless and lawless America? Both depictions can't be true. Or can they? Turns out that the first part of the 19th century was a time of remarkable social and moral chaos. But how could that be, you might? Wasn't America founded as a Christian nation just a few decades earlier? How could it degrade so soon? Well, it turns out that America wasn't quite so Christian at its founding as many American Christians today might like to think. I do think now that the principles of limited government, religious liberty, human equality, and checks and balances embodied in our founding documents unquestionably reflect biblical principles. I also think that many, though certainly not all, leaders of the time of America's founding were sincere Christians, like John Jay, who Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was also head of the American Bible Society. But the view of America's early years as a golden age of Christian society is simply not true. It's estimated that in 1776, less than 1 in 5 Americans were members or even seriously affiliated with a church. Less than 1 in 5, about 17%. And by the 1790s, shortly after the new Constitution had been adopted, many Americans were smitten by the secular ideals of the French Revolution and the progressive teachings of Unitarianism. As I've already suggested, by the early 1800s, in fact, Unitarians would take over many of the congregations in New England. Here's yet another formerly Trinitarian Christian church that became a Unitarian church as the Unitarians swept through New England. But here's the really interesting fact. Fast forward from 1776 to 1860, and you will notice a vast change in the landscape. Maybe America at its founding wasn't a Christian nation by some definitions, but America by the 1850s certainly seemed to be. In 1776, as I said, an estimated only 17% of Americans were actually adherents to a church. By 1860, that was 37%. That was an increase of 118% in just a few decades. So what happened? Did federal and state governments suddenly start funding churches and ministers and evangelists? Did legislative assemblies start enacting laws decreeing that Christianity was the state religion and that people were legally required to follow it? Nope. In fact, almost the opposite happened. An increasing number of states repealed religious requirements for elected officials. And state-supported churches were defunded, even in places like New England, the old haunt of the Puritans. Increasingly, American Christians could no longer rely on government support for their churches. In the words of evangelical minister Lyman Beecher, this new era cut the churches loose from dependence on state support. It threw them wholly on their own resources and on God. Good place to depend on God. What transpired next is commonly known as the Second Great Awakening, referring to a series of evangelical revivals that started in the Northeast, but ultimately spread to the Western frontier. But those revivals only tell a small part of the story. They were paralleled by a mass infusion of evangelical Christians into the public arena, where they organized scores of voluntary associations to preach the gospel, diminish poverty, curb practices such as dueling, and reduce alcoholism. The Second Great Awakening was a messy affair, and the theology of some parts of it could certainly be debated and criticized. Nevertheless, the scores of voluntary associations organized for evangelism, missions, social and political reform transformed American society in a way that few government programs ever could. Again, the Reverend Lyman Beecher was one of the chief theoreticians of this movement for cultural renewal, delivering a series of sermons articulating a system that one historian, later historian actually of our own day, has dubbed America's voluntary establishment of religion. Government used to promote civic virtue by compelling people to support the gospel and attend the public worship of God, Beecher told he told legislators. He was giving this as a sermon to talk to legislators in Connecticut. So he said, government used to promote civic virtue by basically officially, through tax dollars, supporting the worship of God. But, he said, these means of moral influence the law can no longer apply, and there is no substitute but the voluntary energies of the nation itself in associations for charitable contributions and efforts patronized by all denominations of Christians and by all classes of the community who love their country. Beecher advocated replacing government support for religion and morality with a network of voluntary societies who would spread the gospel, inculcate moral habits in the young, reclaim the dissolute. In those cases where government action might still be necessary, the associations would seek to create a public consensus through educational efforts. Because in a free society, Beecher realized persuasion had to precede coercion. Years later, Beecher commented, they say ministers have lost their influence. The fact is, they've gained. By voluntary efforts, societies, missions, and revivals, they exert a deeper influence than they ever could have by state-mandated support. One person who noticed this is a French guy named Alexis de Tocqueville, who visited the United States during the early 1830s. He saw many of these voluntary efforts firsthand, and later wrote about Americans were forever forming associations. The far-reaching network of private groups established by evangelical Christians primarily helped reshape American society before the Civil War and enthroned evangelical Protestantism as the de facto religion of American culture. Three of the most influential reform efforts were Sunday schools, temperance societies, and anti-poverty programs. I want to talk briefly about each of them because they give a picture of just how dramatically 19th century American evangelicals impacted the society and culture of their day. First, there were Sunday schools. During a time when public education was virtually non-existent in many areas, particularly on the western frontier, Sunday schools formed the backbone of education in many communities, teaching both children and adults to read and instructing them in the principles of morality and the gospel. In 1828, an estimated 127,000 pupils attended Sunday classes. By 1835, that figure had expanded to 1 million. From 1828, 127,000 Sunday school participants. 1835, 1 million. To accommodate such large numbers required an extensive infrastructure of 16,000 Sunday schools and more than 130,000 teachers, all of whom volunteered their time without remuneration. Some of the more prominent Sunday school teachers in antebellum America included President William Henry Harrison. The vast majority of Sunday schools were affiliated with the American Sunday School Union, which spearheaded an aggressive program to spread these classes into new areas of the country and published vast quantities of reading material in the hopes of reforming the character of Americans' children's literature. By 1830, the Union had produced at least 250 separate works. 46 of these had been released within the previous year, adding over 6,000 pages of new reading material. The way the American Sunday School Union transformed American society at that time and a whole coming generation is largely an untold story that is just worth learning about. Then there were the temperance societies. Now, I realize Christians have different views about whether one can drink alcohol. I myself don't think it's wrong, even though I choose not to drink. But Christians have pretty much agreed that getting drunk or being ruled or ruined by alcohol is wrong. And in early 19th century America, there was a lot of alcohol-induced devastation for Christians to be concerned about. So that's why many Christians decided to act. By 1828, more than 400 temperance societies had been established across the United States, including statewide societies in New Hampshire, Vermont, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Illinois. These societies sought to educate the public about the extent of alcohol abuse and to pressure retailers not to deal in alcoholic beverages. Sometimes pressure was exerted through a boycott. Many local societies pointed to significant drops in liquor consumption as proof of their effectiveness. The third example of voluntary reform efforts I want to look at were anti-poverty programs. In the 1800s, a number of local evangelical groups focused on helping and educating the poor. But these explicit efforts to help the hardcore poor were only a small part of the evangelical anti-poverty agenda of the era. More informally, working-class people who were drawn to evangelical churches found they now had access to a variety of resources that could help them improve their economic status. In fact, there's a famous study of revivals and church attendance in the early 1800s in Rochester, New York. that shows, so wealthy church members in Rochester organized a savings bank for the benefit of working men and women, and they provided capital for budding entrepreneurs among Christian working class people by forming business partnerships with them. As a result of these measures and the personal discipline and industry instilled by evangelical theology, converts from the working classes experienced a profound upward mobility in Rochester. In fact, of the clerks who joined, so store clerks who joined churches during the revivals and who remained in Rochester in 1837, 72% ultimately became merchants, professionals, or shopkeepers. Similar efforts were made to assist impoverished women. Female reform associations served as a kind of informal employment agency for needy young women. Participation in evangelical voluntary associations reached phenomenal levels before the Civil War in major population centers like New York City. By 1829, more than 40% of the children in New York City between the ages of 4 and 14 attended Sunday schools. More than 40% in New York City of children between the ages of 4 and 14. And by 1860, nearly half of all adult Protestant males in New York City were members of at least one church-related voluntary association. Nearly half. The impact of this wave of reform efforts could also be seen on Americans' consumption of alcohol, which had risen dramatically early in the 1800s and was fostering brawling and other forms of civil disorder in America's cities. By 1850, after decades of temperance efforts, per capita, so per person, consumption of alcohol in America had plummeted by 80%. This was before the misguided effort, in my view, of national prohibition efforts and the National Constitutional Amendment that was a few decades before that. Before that, reduction of 80% through primarily voluntary efforts. Now, some social reforms do require laws to establish justice, laws to protect the innocent. But we need to understand that culture is not just politics. And it's not simply dictated by government or laws. Everyone has a hand in creating culture, and that includes Christians and their churches. Despite all that's currently happening today, Bible-believing Christians throughout the United States still have more freedom to influence and shape culture than in many other places of the world. And the experience of American evangelicals in the first half of the 19th century provides a roadmap, I think, for what can be achieved with God's help and with God's blessing. So for the rest of my talk, I'd like to focus on just 4 areas where Christians today can shape the culture, not primarily through government action or laws, which I think are important, but that's not really the subject of what I'm talking about tonight, but through their own voluntary efforts. I'm going to start with something that may not seem like a huge thing, but I think it's interesting. The first area is public celebrations. So now, in some ways, when it comes to culture, we are what we celebrate. What we celebrate shows what we value. If we celebrate consumerism or depraved behaviors, that shows what our culture values. In America today, our public celebrations are increasingly secular, consumer-oriented, and depraved. And in, let's see, a couple months, in June, we'll see all sorts of pride marches and other things that will highlight some of that. But these public celebrations aren't dictated primarily by the government. They're shaped by everyone. And Christians, if we choose, can reshape what our culture chooses to celebrate. There's a famous picture from March 1956 that has circulated on the internet in recent years. Many people find this picture so strange, so utterly bizarre, that they think it must be fake. So many people have wondered about it that Snopes.com has even done a fact check on it. And some of their fact checks aren't all that accurate, but this one is. You know what? According to Snopes, the picture is genuine. And so just what is in this utterly bizarre picture? Here it is. It shows 3 skyscrapers in New York City, the financial district, on Easter weekend 1956. The windows of each skyscraper are lit up to create a giant cross for all to see. 3 giant crosses representing Jesus and the thieves crucified on Good Friday, displayed for hundreds of thousands of people to see on Easter weekend. Actually, these crosses were ultimately seen by millions of Americans because United Press Service at the time took a photo and sent it out on the newswire, so that hundreds of newspapers across the country republished it. This was a stunning public demonstration of the true meaning of Easter. But here's the thing. Those 3 skyscrapers weren't government buildings. They were all privately owned. And they provide a glimmer of what is possible if Christians are serious about creating a culture that publicly honors Christ and good things in general. Now, America recognizes at least 5 holidays that actually have roots in Christianity. We have Christmas, we have Easter, we have Thanksgiving, we have Mother's Day, I'll get to the roots of that, and we have Father's Day. You may not realize it, but Mother's Day was initiated as a church celebration by a Methodist woman, Anna Jarvis, and Father's Day was initiated by a Methodist woman in our own state because she thought we shouldn't leave dads out of it, and I agree, shouldn't do that. Her name was Sonora Smart Dodd. Sonora was from Spokane, and after hearing a Mother's Day sermon in her church, she convinced the Spokane Ministerial Association to create a day in their churches to honor godly fathers as well. Each of these Christian-inspired holidays has been largely taken over by secular culture and drained of their Christian content. But that can change. Here's just a list of things that Christians can do right now to create public celebrations that honor Christ and biblical truth. Let's just talk about marches. One thing Christians can do is march. Throughout history, public marches and processions have been a way to celebrate as a community. Even today, many communities have Christmas or Thanksgiving parades. In most American cities, they are completely secular. But that doesn't mean it has to be the case. In many countries throughout history, Christians have held public nativity and Holy Week processions through public streets that point to the true meaning of Christmas and Easter. Right now, Christians in America can sponsor their own parades on public streets as public events to celebrate Christmas and Easter, to recognize and honor families, even to explicitly proclaim Jesus as Lord. Starting in England in the 1980s, Christians around the world, for at least a decade or more, began to hold annual marches for Jesus in their communities. One year in the 1990s, 1.5 million Americans in 550 cities across our country participated. I remember being with my wife Sonia on our honeymoon in a small English village called Glastonbury in 1997, when suddenly out of nowhere we heard people publicly singing praise songs. We went to the street, and lo and behold, there were Christians marching down the main street of the village in a procession for Jesus. In Sao Paulo, Brazil, where I know some people, the annual March for Jesus drew 5 million people in 2010 and 2011. And this is actually a more recent photo of a March for Jesus in Sao Paulo, Brazil. As long as these marches are sponsored by private groups, those private groups have control over the message of their marches. And they can exclude groups that want to disrupt their message. The U.S. Supreme Court made this clear in a unanimous ruling back in 1995. So, for example, if you organize a Mother's Day parade, you don't have to accept as part of the parade a group that denies the reality of biological sex. But there are other ways. You can sponsor your own block parties, street festivals, special events. In the church where I grew up, the choir joined with choirs from 3 other churches each Advent to put on a community Christmas concert. It became one of the community's signature Christmas events, drawing large crowds. Some years ago, I was part of a church in Tacoma Stadium District where a holiday parade was going to go in front of the church. So we opened up the church's courtyard during the parade to offer people free hot cider, and then we invited parade watchers to attend a Christmas concert in the church once the parade was over. Following that, for many years, the Stadium District Business Association in Tacoma has sponsored a Dickens Street Festival, and that church planned Christmas concert that were recognized an official part of the festival. And at that concert, the gospel message would be presented. Post-COVID shutdowns of a couple of years ago, I think there is a renewed hunger for events where people can gather together and mingle as members of the community. There is a strategic opportunity here, I think, that Christians can use to reshape culture into something better. These sorts of community events organized by Christians used to be very common even here in the secularized Pacific Northwest. But they seem to have become less common as many Christians have retreated into their own sealed communities. Sometimes it takes someone with a fresh perspective to see the opportunity. Less than 10 minutes from where I live right now, there's a large Slavic Bible church. Most of their services are not in English, But they've decided that they want to make an impact for the entire community of people who do speak English. And they've decided to do large musical events in English each year. One, a Christmas concert, and the other, an Easter concert. These concerts focus on the true meaning of Christmas and Easter. They present the gospel, but they are framed as community celebrations. Members of the church invite friends and neighbors. They even go out into the streets and at gas stations to invite people to come. In fact, last Christmas, they even sent a parade through neighborhoods at night featuring musicians, a float, singers, lights, in order to get people to want to come. So they went through the neighborhoods with this parade. It was quite interesting. Their whole church is involved in these elaborate productions, which include a mass choir and orchestra and are followed by a reception with home-cooked food and prepared by members of the church. This same church last fall held a neighborhood barbecue with music, food, and activities. Again, the community was invited. These Christians are making their church a focal point for community gatherings, and in so doing, they are shaping the culture of their local community. You can also shape celebrations through public displays. Sometimes these displays can be on public property like a park or town square, if that public property is open for displays by private groups. Now, there's an irony about the political uproar a few months ago over this pagan idol set up in the Iowa Capitol building. That's because the idol was put up in direct response to a movement by Christians to make sure that there is now going to be a nativity display in every state capitol during Christmas. And in 2023, at least 43 state capitals, including Washington State, had nativity displays sponsored by private groups, again, including here in Washington. That was a record number. And it was precisely because Christians had been so successful in putting up nativity displays that a group of secularists tried to put up an idol. For myself, I think the proper response to the privately sponsored idol was not to decapitate it, but for more Christian groups to submit more nativity displays so that those displays would dwarf the lone idol. But you don't need for the public displays to be on public property to make a public impact. Churches, businesses, and individual homes can all put up displays that can change the atmosphere around a celebration. Instead of Santa or the Easter Bunny, imagine Christian after Christian publicly displaying nativity scenes, crosses, banners of the empty tomb, and even projecting images on their buildings of Bible verses or scenes from the Bible. If they want to, Christians can also create their own monuments and memorials. In the Old Testament, monuments were a way to commemorate something God has done. There's been a lot of conflict over the past few decades over monuments to things like the Ten Commandments on public property. In many cases, those have not been allowed anymore. That does not mean that Christians need to be silenced. Many churches or individual Christians already own strategically located pieces of property, perhaps on their town's main street, or at a major intersection, or across from a public park. You can place your monument on private property and still make a public impact. One of my favorite examples of this is Desert Christ Park, which is a city, it's in a city in the California desert. The park started with a vision of a pastor and a sculptor who wanted to create giant statues of the life of Jesus placed on a hill for all to see. Desert Christ Park still exists, and it draws visitors from all over the world. After the sculptor's death, the property was bequeathed for a time to the local city government as a public park, which provoked the ACLU to sue. The ACLU won. But here's the thing, Desert Christ Park was not shut down. It was returned to private ownership, and today it is still a park for the public, and it still attracts, I think, thousands upon thousands of visitors each year. It's a monument that recognizes the centrality of Christ. And there are lots of other interesting examples throughout America that if I had time, some in Michigan on our vacation this last year, that it's just creating monuments, which is a very biblical thing in the Old Testament. There are lots of things that you can do. Okay, but moving on, public performances. Here's another example of how Christians can retake public celebrations that have become increasingly secularized. Public performances. At one time, churches throughout America had bell towers. These bell towers called people to church. They marked public holidays. They tolled in memory of people, including public figures who had died. Bell towers gave way to tubular bells and chimes, which allowed you to play hymns that your neighbor or praise songs that your neighborhood and city would hear on Sunday mornings, Christmas Eve, and other important days. Probably the most important or prolific producer of tubular bells for churches in the 20th century was the J.C. Deegan Company of Illinois. From the 1920s through the 1950s, the Deegan Company installed tower chimes in over 400 churches throughout the United States. The church where I was a member in Tacoma Stadium District was one of those churches. Their tubular bells still worked thanks to a couple of dedicated church members who had rebuilt them and maintained them. It was one of my great joys until the chimes broke again to play hymns and carols on them before and after each service and before Christmas Eve service. Until just a few years ago, the city park, Wright Park, and neighbors surrounding the church would hear the sound of Christian carols and hymns on Sunday and sacred holidays. But you don't need a bell tower to create a public performance. Think about, in recent years, the phenomenon of flash mobs that take over public spaces. Not to riot, but to sing and make music. Several years ago, there was a series of shopping malls where flash mobs performed songs like Amazing Grace and the Hallelujah Chorus. In fact, even today, if you look up Flash Mob and Hallelujah Chorus on YouTube, you'll find one of these takeovers of a shopping mall that now has 55 million views on YouTube. These are just a few ideas about how Christians today can use our religious freedom to refocus public celebrations on things that honor God. But now let me address 3 additional areas besides public celebrations: marriage, education, and leadership development. How might Christians, using their First Amendment freedoms, seek to forge a culture that promotes and defends biblical marriage, for example? Well, through the 1990s, over 60% of Americans were married in religious wedding ceremonies. 50% of those ceremonies were in actual churches or places of worship, while another 13% were in secular venues but officiated by a religious leader. Michael McManus is a Christian who was a journalist. In the 1980s, he and his wife, Harriet, grew very concerned about the dramatic rise in divorce in America. They had an intriguing idea. Most Americans, they noted, still wanted to get married in a church or in a wedding at least officiated by a minister. They thought that this gave churches and pastors strategic leverage to influence the marriages that would take place in their communities. What would happen, they wondered, if you got all of the ministers in a community to pledge that they would not marry anyone without insisting on serious premarital counseling and also on supplying mentor couples who could help newly married people if they faced problems? Well, they found out. In 1986, Modesto, California was the first city where the McManuses were able to convince most local clergy to adopt such a community marriage policy. The divorce rate in Modesto was cut by half, actually by over half, for quite a number of years. Ultimately, more than 200 community marriage policies were adopted in cities across the United States. According to one independent study, these community marriage policies on average resulted in a cut in the divorce rate by close to 18%. In several cities like Modesto, the divorce rate dropped by 50% or more. In El Paso, Texas, the divorce rate plunged 79% after clergy adopted the policy. Christians in these communities changed their culture by taking their responsibilities to support marriage seriously and acting together. Could this work today? Maybe. One challenge is that fewer people today want a religious marriage ceremony. According to a 2022 survey, only 30% of people married in the previous decade had marriages in churches or places of worship. On the other hand, another 18% got married in a non-religious venue, but at a ceremony officiated by a minister. So that's still nearly half of all marriages in America, either taking place at a church or at least being officiated by a minister. So if churches and ministers today agreed to adopt a community marriage policy, the results on culture could still be significant in many communities. Okay, wish I had more time on that, but let's go on to education. Raising children is a primary God-given function of families and churches, and it's not the state. It's if your parents and churches can come alongside you. So educating children is a key part of culture, one that our culture increasingly does a terrible job at. Social media platforms and Hollywood want to raise your children in ways that will destroy them. Public schools are often no better. And there are lots of really wonderful Christians in public schools who are doing their best, but I'm talking about as an overall system. Public schools in many areas are often no better, depending on your community. So how can Christians help change the culture here using their First Amendment freedoms? Of course, the most obvious ways including starting private Christian schools and supporting homeschools and homeschool co-ops. The church I'm a member of is now involved in sponsoring a K-12 Christian school in cooperation with other churches, but also a ministry to assist homeschoolers. And I know that your church sponsors a classical Christian academy, which is absolutely wonderful. I think you're doing God's work and helping to build our culture through that. And I just want to encourage you with what Christians are doing around the nation now. Last spring, I was at an event in Chicago where inner cities, whether it be Seattle or Chicago or Washington, D.C. or New York, are really struggling. Families, gangs, it's really struggling. But one of the most inspiring recent events in the last few years I've been at was this conference of evangelically conservative African Americans in Chicago last year. And one large Chicago area church, shared about its vision of providing their own Christian schools as an alternative to the corrupt public education system in that city. Last summer, I met another pastor from the Bronx whose church is doing something similar for inner city youth in New York. But Christians can also use their First Amendment freedoms to influence public schools. In many states, Christians can start publicly funded charter schools that are faith-friendly and teach biblical morality. At the same conference where I attended, where an African-American pastor shared about creating private schools in Chicago, another African-American Christian from New York City shared about his mission of creating charter schools in New York City that reflected a biblical worldview. But you don't have to start a charter school to influence public education. There are frequently one or more churches across the street or down the block from a public school. That is a very strategic location. For high school students, a nearby church can offer an alternative school lunch program once a week to draw on students for encouragement and fellowship. For grade school students, a church next door could offer supervised after-school activities that integrate a Christian worldview. Many working parents are desperate for after-school options for their kids. But a church doesn't need to be next to a public school to shape public education either. In many public school districts, Christian students have the right to create on-campus clubs for Bible study or apologetics or other Christian activities. This is the result of really a decade of litigation and Christian activism in the 1980s and early 90s that bequeathed this right. But now that we have the right, we should use it. Those clubs can be outposts for God's kingdom in those schools. Child Evangelism Fellowship is one group that sponsors after-school clubs. They call them Good News Clubs in public schools to share about the good news of Jesus. Child Evangelism Fellowship reports that there are currently more than 3,200 of these Good News Clubs in approximately 2,000 schools across the United States. According to the group, a survey of over 200 principals from 28 states whose schools have Good News Clubs indicated that 87% of those principals noticed an improvement in student behavior after the clubs were established. There are even more ways Christians can influence public schools. Public schools can't officially have baccalaureate services for their graduating seniors. It doesn't matter. Churches can band together and create such services themselves. I attended Federal Way Public Schools decades ago now. In that district, there was a baccalaureate service that encouraged students in their Christian faith, but the baccalaureate service was sponsored by churches, not the school district. It wasn't officially a school event, but when teachers and school officials and student leaders all attend, it becomes, for all practical purposes, a school event. But because it's privately sponsored and attendance is voluntary, it's allowable. Or consider doing back-to-school prayer rallies. Such an event was held in Federal Way in 1998. The prayer rally was publicized by stories in local newspapers, including the Seattle Times, who thought surely there was something illegal about this, but it turned out it wasn't. So there were no legal threats over the event, yet it took place in the public high school stadium, which was rented. It was promoted by the superintendent of the school district, who at the time happened to be a Christian, but he promoted it in his private capacity. It was a community event, but it was promoted by a school official in his private capacity. For all practical purposes, this was a civic celebration, but its official sponsor was a group of community, primarily church leaders, rather than government. In short, the event was what might be called privately sponsored public speech. Speech and activities that are in the public square, they're not officially sponsored by the government, so it was allowable. I think there's a lot more ways that Christians, if they understand what freedoms that they have, can be creative today to influence things like this. One final area where churches can shape culture. One of the biggest problems today with our culture is not that Christians aren't in places of leadership in the culture. There are, in fact, plenty of Christians who have positions of influence in the media, the arts, education, science, politics, and more. This is one of the critiques where I disagree with Aaron Wren in his book. He makes a big thing, well, evangelical Christians, they're not in the levers of government, they're not enough in these powerful areas. That's just simply not true. Consider, for example, Francis Collins. Collins is a well-known evangelical Christian. As head of the National Institutes of Health, he served as America's top, most powerful scientist under 3 presidents. He made decisions that impacted all of us. But what were some of those decisions? Well, under his leadership, his agency spent millions of tax dollars to harvest body parts from late-term aborted babies for use in medical research. It funded removing the breasts of girls as young as 13 to facilitate gender transitions, so-called gender transitions. Collins himself pledged to be an ally and advocate, his words, of the LGBTQI movement, and he expected all of his employees to be the same. The problem with many Christians like Collins who are in positions of power today is that they tend to be what I describe as Stockholm Syndrome Christians. They identify more with secular culture than with biblical Christianity. So they don't help reform existing culture, they help perpetuate it. But who's responsible for this situation? These Stockholm Syndrome Christians in culturally influential positions attend churches for the most part, even biblical churches. As I said, Francis Collins identifies as an evangelical Christian, not just a liberal Christian, an evangelical Christian, and was friends with lots of other leading evangelical Christians. But these evangelical Christians in leadership obviously aren't getting what they need to lead a cultural transformation. I think, therefore, Christians need to become, and churches need to become more intentional about recruiting and training leaders, including future leaders. I know of one church in the Dallas area that now offers its high school students a gap year experience where they volunteer for the church, but they also receive worldview training that equips them to help shape the culture in the future. Other churches and parachurch groups like, say, the Charles Colson Center offer programs for Christian professionals to help equip them for how to stand for Christ in their careers, their businesses, and in culture. At my current home church, we have a member who has had a vision for providing training and equipping in the area of cultural formation. That's led him to organize an annual conference focusing on how Christians can interact with the culture. Leadership training is how you transform the culture over the long haul. It's the approach Jesus himself used when he mentored a small group of disciples who then proclaimed the good news around the world. I've seen this approach work firsthand. For over 15 years, I've helped direct a summer program that trains graduate students and professionals who want to impact debates over faith and science. We're now beginning to see students we've mentored become college professors themselves, researchers, get tenure, and begin to make their own mark on the world as tenured professors, working scientists, writers, public intellectuals. So I've seen this process work, but you have to invest in it, and you have to train people for it. Okay. In today's America, public life is too often equated with just the activities of government. But as the 19th century evangelicals realized, and I hope we should realize too, the public square encompasses far more than government and private individuals, and groups can provide public goods when government cannot or will not. Christians don't need to depend on a Christian Caesar or on the top down to reform the culture. We can start reforming the culture right now from the bottom up. Thank you. It's not my iPad.
All right, we're going to do our Q&A.
So who's in which?
You get to pick. You're the guest.
Well, I guess I'll be over here.
There we are. I have a huge iPad because my eyes are so bad. All right. So nothing that you said tonight sounded like a quick fix. It's the long game.
It is. It's generational, and if you want long-term results, you have to invest in the long term.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Okay, so we're going to work through some of these questions here. Do you understand the Ten Commandments to be the moral law that Christians should define righteousness by as they vote or pursue public civil service?
well, I certainly think the Ten Commandments form part of the moral law, and certainly have been influential in the development of Western civilization in particular. I don't know that I would regard that as the only thing that you should be focusing on, and the ways that you apply some of them are a little bit distinct. So like I said, I would disagree that in the so-called first table of the law that the government should be putting people in jail if they worship someone other than the true God, for example. So, but I certainly would generally agree that what Calvin actually pointed out, and C.S. Lewis in his book that we were discussing actually beforehand, The Abolition of Man, that there is this moral common ground that God wrote on our hearts. Yes, it's defaced by our sin, but it's still there to some degree, and Romans 1 and 2 talk about this. And as Calvin described, the Ten Commandments is nothing more than really the law written on your heart, so that he thought that was part of the moral common ground. And I would agree with that. But again, I think we need to be careful about when it comes to politics, and I was a political science professor, I could give a whole lecture on that. I believe in limited government, and so I do think Christians need to think through what they want the levers of government to do, and realize in a sinful world that anything that they use to do something can come back and bite them.
Sure.
Let me actually give one practical example of this. In the 19th century, how did we develop a primarily, by the end of the century, early 20th century, a primarily state-run educational system? Well, one of the things, and it influenced this state in particular, because there were, say we had an influx of people who were Catholic, who didn't read the King James Bible, they wanted to read their version of the Bible. There were riots in places like Philadelphia because the public schools were forcing Catholic kids to read a version of the Bible that they didn't have, actual riots. So Protestant evangelicals came up with the idea, Protestantism, that's just the general common sense notion, and so we're going to make that that's non-sectarian, and we can make sure that no state dollars ever go to, say, school choice. Say if you were a Catholic, they didn't want the government to provide any support for Catholic schools for Catholic kids. That was the thing. And so by doing that, they created a fully public educational system thinking, well, we'll always be in control. One of the biggest legal obstacles that we now are mostly over, but there's still was something called Blaine Amendment language. This was a proposed constitutional amendment that evangelical Christians came up with in the mid-19th century to make sure that no state tax dollars ever went to religious schools, by which they thought just meant Catholic schools, because they thought in the public schools, of course, we'll teach non-denominational Christianity. Fast forward a couple, 150 years later, when now that's not true. And evangelical Christians are saying, well, let's have vouchers, or let's have other things so it doesn't all just, force you to send your kids to the public school unless you can afford otherwise. And in many states, fortunately that constitutional amendment never passed, but Congress began to require states to adopt it in their own constitutions before they'd be allowed in as a state. So our state constitution has Blaine Amendment language. That was a big obstacle legally to having voucher programs. And it was actually something largely evangelical Christians created, because they thought they were solving one problem, because they were so upset about allowing Catholics to send their kids to their own schools. So beware. what you ask government to do, because it may not be that long before it's doing something you don't want.
Sure,
So.
sure. It's good. This is about Romans 13.
Yes.
I'm
Yep.
sure you've never had a question on Romans 13.
Yeah.
It says, what is the job of government? Or it says that the job of government is to reward good and punish evil. Where should a Christian who holds public office find their standard of good and evil?
Well, obviously, the Christian's final standard is God himself, who reveals it in the Bible. But I would point out that the Christians have believed from the beginning times, and this was not something that separated either Catholics or Protestants. You'll find what I'm about to say in Luther and Calvin just as much as in Aquinas or C.S. Lewis. That sometimes I think Christians go astray when they try to claim that the morality in the Bible is somehow a unique form of morality that you can't know, that you can't, that doesn't apply to you unless you're a Christian. Lewis's point, Calvin's point, Luther's point is that God created a moral law to the universe. Everyone has some access to it. So when you're talking about, yes, your standard as a Christian may come from the Bible, but when you're actually framing public laws and stuff, you're actually you're not imposing the Bible, because you don't need to be a Christian to know that murder is wrong. You don't need to be most human cultures have recognized that actually bearing false witness is wrong. Most human cultures have recognized that treating elderly people and treating your parents, elders, is a good thing. Keeping your promises is a good thing. So I would say that Christians should primarily take their cues from the Bible, but when you're translating biblical principles and things into public policy, I think you need to recognize that the end of government is not the same as the end of the church. And I don't, for a lot of human history, Christians, I think, confuse that. And by doing that, they ended up even persecuting each other. And if you recognize that the role of government is to create civil harmony and peace and create the conditions where churches and families can flourish, then that provides some limits on what you should and shouldn't try to impose by law. So.
Okay. This question is, as secular ideologies approach religious status and leftist presidents function as secular princes, how do we advocate against secular nationalism?
Well, I don't think you do it by advocating Christian nationalism, because that, in a way, is really just embracing, saying they're right, but we are of a different party, so we want to impose our way. I think and I don't know, I'll be honest, I don't know how many years we still have a window to do this, because polls are unfortunately showing something I never thought they would, that large segments of Americans don't really believe in the First Amendment anymore. They don't really believe in free speech. They don't believe, and so, but I think we are still in a window where some of those things still exist, and you are seeing this. Some of the stuff post-COVID, the overreach. If you actually look at the wide coalition of people now who are concerned by in essence, the deification of the secular government, the sacralization of whatever is woke or whatever. The people who are rejecting that are far more than just Christians or even Muslims or Jews or faith. It's even many sort of small s secularists who are horrified by what their philosophy is leading to. So they may not be consistent, but they at least do think, well, no, censorship is bad, that we shouldn't be, shutting down churches or mandating that people do things with their bodies, whether it be, I'm really getting into controversial things here, but you're mandating vaccinations, doing all this stuff. So I actually do think there's a constituency right now, may not last, to build on really saying we don't want to go that route. I mean, you could just look in Canada. If you want to see where America could be within 5 years, look at Canada, look at England, where they're now. In England, if you're praying silently across from an abortion clinic, you will be jailed. So America still, despite what's happening, still has much more freedoms, but it's imploding, and the consensus to support it is imploding. So I actually think the most important things Christians can do right now is join with what Francis Schaeffer would have called co-belligerents of people on for free speech, for limited government, for the government not micromanaging you from birth to death, and controlling what you think and punishing you for things that you should be able to have legitimate differences of opinion. Because right now there is a constituency, and if one of the big practical fears I have on some of the people who are advocating for Christian nationalism is they're really advocating, we don't want that, so they're trying to pine for something that I think would be bad, but it won't happen, whereas right now you have constituency involving many non-Christians. If you want to see where this goes, go on the internet and type in about school board meetings in Detroit, where you have Muslim parents, largely from Africa, irate about their school district trying to put all this transgenderism and everything in their force-fed down their kids' throats. You have, I'd say, you actually do have, I hope, still a majority of people who have some sanity there. We should be doing our utmost right now to build on that, to provide the freedom to flourish.
Yeah. I know why I'm asking the question.
Yeah,
I want to piggyback on what you just
sure.
said. We talked about this a little bit before. One of the things that we've seen is that when churches or Christians are speaking up about these things, there is something very attractive about that from non-believers. And there's a number of people that have reached out who do not share my convictions or my faith, but have been very thankful for things that were said and have led to conversations about, maybe I need to think about going back to church. I haven't been a religious person, but maybe I need to think about this.
The benefit, the silver lining, if you will, in the massive overreach by all levels of government right now is that many people who are, and there's still a lot of people who really aren't following what's happening, and then there are the people who are just so bought into it. It is like, it's cult-like. But I'm talking about everyone else. There are a lot of people who may have been facilitating some of this stuff earlier who now are seeing that it's eating its own and that they don't even have freedom to think what they believe. And so they are open to actually establishing some parameters and guaranteeing freedom, including for Christians. And I think now is the time to seize that and build on it because it's not going to last. And I don't know how long a window we have.
Yeah. Okay, here's the interesting one. It says, what are your thoughts on peaceful local secession movements and embracing libertarian societies wherein all public property and governance is privatized?
Yeah, I'm not a great fan of that. First of all, I don't think peaceful secession is actually I think one is deluding oneself if you think that could happen. I really do appreciate a lot of the insights of libertarians, and there are different branches of it. I think some branches of secular libertarianism in particular deify, well, the founders distinguished, America's founders distinguished, freedom is different from two things, from slavery and from license. Freedom was sort of the golden mean between them. Freedom was not actually the right to do absolutely everything you want, no matter how hurtful or destructive to yourself, let alone others. It was the golden mean between license, that was license and anarchy, or slavery. And so I know there are many sincere Christian libertarians, and they temper some of this, but I'd just be cautious. There are many different ways to go wrong. And so now having said that, I actually think an emphasis more on localism, more on private associations, on having private educational options that ultimately dwarf public educational options, and maybe even, I actually think it would be great to have a system where you make sure that everyone can be educated, but maybe it's through all sorts of private things that parents get to choose. So I'm a great believer in the increasing of privatization for public goods and for limiting. I think the government is in way too many things that it should be in people of ceded power. Having said that, I'm not a full-fledged libertarian. I certainly don't agree with secession. So.
Okay. Where did that one go? There was one on eschatology that I really wanted to ask you. Oh, here it is. How much can pessimistic eschatology and dispensationalism be credited for the retreat and abandonment of Christians in social, cultural, and political spheres?
Yeah. There's a lot of theoretical debate over that. I actually think that if you look at the particular people who have done things in American history that have impacted the culture, you'll find people, whether they're premillennial, amillennial, postmillennial. And so although I can see some potential ways you can take those things to either discourage or, on the other hand, to have a naive view that we're going to usher in heaven on earth in our own power, I don't think that the evidence is that strong that the connection was quite as strong as some people might think. Mm-hmm. So, for example, say if you have a premillennial view, which probably the majority of evangelicals do, that doesn't, I mean, if you look at what changed, the movement that ultimately led to the overturn of Roe v. Wade, that was not primarily dominated by people who had a postmillennial view or amillennial view. Just wasn't. That they were part of, I mean, and so I think plenty of reforms of culture, and whenever God is going to come back, and whenever things are going to play out, it really is, even in a true premillennial view, it's not that everything's just getting worse and worse and worse. Yes, there are going to be things, but individual cultures rise and fall. You see that throughout the Old Testament. I mean, there are times of faithfulness, there are other things, and so you don't know, except I guess if you're Hal Lindsey or something, you don't know what God's timetable is.
There's a new book.
Anyway, that's unfair to, he didn't actually say there was a timetable exactly, but my point is that, properly speaking, whatever your view of eschatology, you really don't know the day and hour. You do know the commands that God has given you to be faithful, and faithful in your family, to model. And it's not just that, it's who wouldn't want to? It's, how many of you have been in downtown Seattle recently? Okay. Well, then you'll know what I'm talking about. It's the saddest possible thing. It's not that you're trying to be hard-hearted. It's precisely because we're warm-hearted and because you don't want people to suffer that way that you want to model something different. And so even if you don't save your overall culture, you may save a piece of it. You may create human flourishing for people who otherwise would be dying from fentanyl or on the streets permanently homeless. So like I said, I do understand some of the theoretical arguments on it, but practically speaking, I think that is a red herring that people, we want to debate eschatology rather than focus on what God is calling us to do here and now.
Yeah. And there's definitely a tendency to make a caricature of particular eschatologies. And one of the things that's really interesting about the last, back to 2020, is that some of the most outspoken, active, involved churches and leaders were not of the post-mill persuasion. They were our pre-mill brothers who were fighting the good fight.
Yeah, they were both, so yeah.
Okay, I've got one more. Have you seen any examples of churches banding together in communities to help families eliminate debt, build up inheritances, start businesses, and serve others?
Oh, that's really a good question. I don't have any great examples. I do think I've heard rumors of such examples, and that would really follow what what I talked about in Rochester, New York, of how evangelicals operated in some of the cities in the early 19th century, was to provide capital and other things to help build up. So it wasn't when, today we think, poverty, anti-poverty, well, you help the homeless. We should do all that. But no, it's also building up entrepreneurship, helping people so they can be self-sufficient, doing, things. And so I think that's a great thing. I do know, obviously, a lot of churches are involved in various financial studies programs to help get people out of debt and help and do, financial wisdom classes by various, I won't name the the ones, but they, and I think that's good, assuming that the curriculum is good. But I think more broadly of providing, capital and things like that is and I do know some churches who are involved in sort of urban development. I mean, I do something I didn't talk about here. There are a lot of churches who have old church buildings that are centrally located in urban environments that, well, until just a few years ago, were very valuable. Now some of our inner city cores are going back down. You can redevelop that for multiplicity of uses, including your church, but also building exit, maybe putting a parking garage under and building things over it that can give a centerpiece to your community. More than that, I've been pining, do any of you know about there's been not architectural, but a planning trend called of the new urbanism over the past decade. Has some downside because some of it's too controlling. But the good side was trying to focus, well, look at what did town planning do in the 1900s or the 1800s? Well, they focused on things like having anchors. You'd have a church at the anchor of a square. You'd have a public park at the center. You'd have main streets. You'd have things that were walkable, but I'd say we also do need places with parking lots and stuff. But the new urbanists have paid attention to that, and I sort of thought, especially in places where you have new mega developments, where you have big tracts of land, where you have these people who are Christians who are developers, and they're just building this subdivision that looks completely the same as any other subdivision, and they don't even think of that. If they were creative, you could think about, well, if you have 100 acres to build however many homes, 50, 80, 100, what about thinking about plotting a middle place that will be for a future church? What about a central park or a central, in other words, you can plan buildings of the guts of a community. And so I do think this is an area where a lot of things can be done. And I do know of some, there are some in the Congress of New Urbanism. There was I once went to one of their annual meetings, and there was a little group of Christians, or even something as simple as, this is getting off the topic, but churches that have enough land. Do they have land in an urban area to do pea patches for people who want to have their own small gardens? I mean, there are lots of things that churches, depending on the property and things that they have, the main thing is utilize the gifts and the resources God has given you. Don't just pine for other things. So it was so great talking to your pastors and your elders, how they added upstairs there for the balcony, and how you're making mega use of your facilities here for the Christian school and for other things. That's great. And so I think, and then adding great stained glass windows, which I love. I think utilizing the resources and thinking creatively about God has given us these resources. How can we use them to His glory?
Amen. Amen. Well, let's give a round of applause for Dr. West. I think I'm really thankful for what you said, because I think it's too easy to think we've got the wrong guys in power, and if we get the right guys in, it's going to fix everything. And that's not to say that leaders don't influence anything, but everything that you said tonight was be strategic, get involved, be creative, play the long game. And that's all stuff that everybody here is in a position to do. And that's the thing that actually builds towards that reformation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for all your church is doing.
Yes. I'm going to put you on the spot. Are you going to be here for a little while?
Yeah, if people want to.
Okay. I'm gonna plug your website. You need to go to it's johngwest.com, right?
Yeah. It's a new website, so we just built it, so you can go. Okay,
so his books are available there. He also writes and produces documentaries. This guy does everything. So go there, and there's this great documentary called Human Zoos, and I would just go look at that. Your mind will be absolutely blown about racism in our country and things that elite institutions were, and all sorts of people were participating in. So that's just, I was watching that today. I was like, oh, this is crazy. So check out his website. He'll be here for a little while if you want to come talk to him. And maybe if you have another question, you can ask him outside of the little Slido thing. I'm not making that commitment for you. But let's give him another round of applause and thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. Great.
We've got all of this recorded, so if you want to go back and catch it later, it will be online. I'm getting yes, it'll be online. So it'll be on our website. You can check it there. You're welcome to hang out. I think we maybe still have some refreshments in the foyer. You're welcome to enjoy, ask questions, but you are dismissed. Thank you.